If you don't know who Vikings are, you must have probably seen them somewhere on the screens. There is also a very famous TV series called Vikings. They have warrior-like attire and are known to be fearless and strong. Well, do not be mistaken by the fact that they are just movie characters, because they actually existed, and now the research thinks that they might be the first ones to step foot in America. Vikings were sea-voyaging Scandinavians from what today is Denmark, Norway, and Sweden between the late 8th to late 11th centuries, during which they raided, looted, traded, and colonized many parts of Europe and ventured into the Mediterranean, North Africa, the Middle East, Greenland, and Vinland, present-day Newfoundland, and Canada, in their countries of origin and the countries they raided and settled in. This period is known as the Viking Age and refers to the inhabitants of the Scandinavian homelands in general. In the early Middle Ages, the Vikings made a strong impact on developments in Scandinavia, the British Isles, France, Estonia, and Kievan Rus. The Vikings were pirates who were former land-owning chieftains or ordinary chieftains and belonged to a community head in the clan, along with warriors, free men, and young clan members who were adventurers and sought overseas means. These Scandinavians were farmers in peacetime but seafarers and pirates during the Viking Age. During the Viking era, Scandinavian countries had an almost limitless supply of manpower available. They also had good leaders who seldom lacked initiative in organizing bands of warriors that would in turn form armies. These bands traveled by longship, reaching European coastal cities through the Atlantic Ocean to raid them for loot before escaping again, without leaving traces of their presence behind themselves anywhere other than on shorelines where they had landed. In early Scandinavian languages, they earned the name Vikinger, meaning pirate, because of their burning, plundering, and killing. The Vikings founded several cities and territories, like Dublin in Ireland, as well as the region of Normandy in France. Furthermore, Dublin served as an important settlement for over 3 centuries. Iceland was colonized by Vikings between 879 and 920, establishing a base for their move to Greenland. Around 1000 AD, what was left of a Viking settlement at El Anisiomiseawas of Newfoundland has been estimated to date back to around 1000 AD. How could a small and scattered people succeed in achieving so much territory? Norwegians of the Viking period were brave, fatalistic people and were born gamblers. Luck had always been on their side. Men involved in marauding appeared to show an immense ability to ignore their losses, be it on land or during hazardous sea voyages. War killed many Vikings in comparison to their total count, however. It did not quench their thirst for invasion and navigation for about 250 years. The reasons why the Vikings left Scandinavia are not known. It is said that their population grew too large, but the earliest Vikings were interested in wealth rather than land. During the 8th century AD, Europe became wealthier, which resulted in more trading towns opening up, like Dorstad and Quentovik on the continent, and Hamwick, Southampton, London, Ipswich, and York in England. In the trade centers, the Scandinavians had valuable, highly prized furs from their interaction with Europeans. They gathered new sailing technology and also understood the process of increasing wealth, which was growing fast in Europe, causing conflicts within various kingdoms. These Viking precursors attacked pirate merchants passing through their areas, using this knowledge in the Baltic Sea, giving them opportunities to venture into the North Sea, among other regions. The Viking Age started with an attack on Lindisfarne Monastery in England in 793, which is the first recorded Viking raid. King Harald Hardrada was killed in 1066 at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, an incident that marked their decline from glory days. The Vikings traveled through raids, looting, colonization, and trading in search of new destinies, not only within their world boundaries, but also in other continents of the world. At first, just a small number of seafaring Vikings managed to survive harsh sea journeys. This number increased over the years till there were hundreds of longships. These boats were used by them to sail through the Baltic Sea, downstream Russian rivers through the Black Sea, and even down to Byzantium up the Caspian Sea in the Baghdad Caliphate. Who found America? For most of us, the response to this query appears simple: Christopher Columbus. It is how we were educated in our institutions, and it is why we commemorate Columbus Day. Nonetheless, it is not that simple. There are competing theories concerning who came to this land, first some well backed by evidence, while others lack strong grounds in their arguments. Now, according to some history, it was the Vikings who first reached Greenland and North America. That is, around the year 1000 AD. Viking discoverer Leif Erikson landed on the shore of North America about 5 centuries earlier than Christopher Columbus. Well, we will dwell on this deeply and check if it was Christopher Columbus or the Vikings who reached America first. Over the years, there have been many discoveries and theories regarding it, which we will learn about in this video. During the years between 1000 and 1400, Europeans sent expeditions across the Atlantic to Greenland. In the present Antiquity Report, archaeologists from the University of Iceland have shared data that indicate that Vikings set foot on America half a millennium before Columbus, who is commonly believed to have unveiled it in 1492. The researchers have identified the species of tree from which many samples came, indicating that some wood was imported from America as well as Europe. Specifically, they determined that hemlock and jack pine, which did not grow in northern Europe in the second millennium, must have been transported across the Atlantic. Some of the Viking sagas suggest that explorers brought wood from Vinland, which is assumed to be a strip of coastal North America around the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Jack pine occurs naturally along the Mackenzie River, Nova Scotia, and New England, and hemlock is abundant near Quebec, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Ontario, and Nova Scotia. From the years 985 to 1450, Vikings lived in Greenland. An analysis of archaeological data from that period has shown that they used imported materials like iron and timber for major construction projects, shipbuilding, and creation of special items. None of the trees available locally could serve these purposes. The researchers collected samples from wood assemblages in 4 medium-sized elite farms and a bishop's manor, which were known to have been occupied in the first half of the second millennium through radiocarbon dating and artifacts they contained. They used these samples to determine the proportion of foreign wood used by Vikings and its origins. The professionals utilized microscopes to explore the cell structure of the material and identify the kind of trees the wood was obtained from. A proportion of 0.27 was determined as the samples were sourced from exotic species, either from Northern America or parts of Northern Europe. The results verify the presence of many Viking merchant trails in the northwestern Atlantic Ocean and provide evidence for the sagas which claim that early travelers like Leif Erikson, who is assumed to be the first European to set foot on America, brought timber back from Vinland. For centuries, it has been thought by historians that the Greenland Viking Society from 985-14 to 50 AD obtained their timber primarily from America. But it appears this statement is now being supported by physical and scientific evidence for the first time in history through some research analysis. New analysis shows just how much wood must have been used for these quests, which involve some very impressive trading. Norwegian sagas are an example of evidence that shows that Vikings visited or had relations with America even before Christopher Columbus. This is not the first evidence that Vikings were in America before Christopher Columbus. In the early first millennium, there were several trips described in these Norwegian sagas from Greenland to the east coast of North America as early as 1000 AD CE, for instance, Grænlendinga Saga and Erik Saga Rada. This point is made over and over again in many different ways through historical records, such as texts from 14th century Italy, where narratives are showing the Norsemen's direct connection with a place called Markland, which appears to have been a part of the Labrador coast, present-day Canada. In the 1960s, a Viking village found on Newfoundland's island indicates that they were in America around 1,000 years ago. Named El Anciaux Meadows, it is believed to be the first proof of Europe's presence in what is today North America. Too bad for Columbus. Shoo. Now, the main theory suggests that nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus was born, a group of European sailors left their country looking for another one. Their high-prowed Viking ship cut through the cobalt blue waters of the Atlantic, the only sail of the boat swelling full with the wind. At the end of the journey over unknown waters, Norsemen inside the wooden boat saw shorelines, spied around, and dropped their anchors. 500 years before Columbus made his discovery of America, it may have been the European fleet of the Vikings that landed there first. The leader of the expedition, Leif Erikson, belonged to a family that was accustomed to travel in search of new things. His last name is spelled in different ways, Eriksson. Leif's dad, named Erik the Red, left Iceland, where he had been chased away from in 985 AD for killing his neighbor, and settled in Greenland. There is evidence that suggests that it might have been Erik the Red's father who was expelled from Norway for killing either through manslaughter or accidental means. It is believed that Eriksson was born in Iceland in approximately AD 970 and grew up in the barren lands of Greenland. Eriksson sailed towards the east to Norway, where his forefathers came from, and this occurred during the 11th century. There, Olaf I, King Tryggvason, converted him to Christianity, after which he told him to spread the word to the heathens in Greenland. He converted his mother, who established the first Christian church in Greenland, but his father, who was an outlaw, did not succumb to Christianity. Eriksson's adventures were recounted in the New World around AD 1000 in stories that can be traced in Icelandic legends known as sagas. These ancient Norse stories passed by word of mouth before they were written down between the 12th and 13th centuries. Concerning the expedition to America, two sagas present contradictory versions of Eriksson's arrival. according to the saga of Eric the Red Eriksson, crossed the Atlantic accidentally when he was returning to Norway after he had become a Christian. The saga of the Greenlanders, however, recounts that it wasn't by chance that Eriksson arrived in North America. Instead, Icelandic trader Bjarni Herjolfsson had told the Viking explorer of a mysterious land in the western part of the world that he had come across more than 10 years earlier, while trying to locate Greenland, but had never disembarked in. Eriksson purchased the ship of the trader and went back along the same path with a crew of 35 men. Once the Vikings crossed the Atlantic, they found themselves on rocky, barren land that is now located in Canada today. The name that Eriksson gave to this land was very uninteresting. He called it Helluland, an Old Norse word that means stone slab land. Experts suggest that Baffin Island may very well have been situated there. The Norsemen then proceeded south to what is very likely to be a land rich in timber, that they named Markland Forestland, before finally making a probable decision to create a base camp on the northern tip of what appears to have been the island of Newfoundland. Compared to their country of origin, Vikings stayed there for just one winter and enjoyed the better and warmer climate. They found many beautiful meadows and rivers teeming with delicious salmon, while lush green meadows spread across wide open spaces. Eriksson called it Vinland, because it had wild grapes suitable for winemaking. Having spent the winter in Vinland, Eriksson and his men happily sailed towards their wind-battered home of Greenland. Platefuls of grapes and much-needed timber were plenty for them on that trip, so they returned satisfied. Eriksson would later take over from his father as chief in the Greenland settlement after he died, which never made him go back to North America anymore, but many other Vikings kept sailing further west of Vinland over the next 10 years. Despite North America having many resources, the Viking settlers stayed in Greenland. However, this could have been a result of numerous wars. For example, Thorwald's brother, who belonged to Eriksson, was killed by the indigenous people of the north. Even though Columbus has a federal holiday named after him, no one has yet forgotten the man who is believed to have been the captain of the first European expedition to North America. It was in 1964 when President Lyndon Johnson appended his signature on a proclamation announcing the recognition of October 9th as Leif Erikson Day to honor the Viking explorer and his team members, as well as celebrate their Nordic American roots. It just so happens that Eriksson and Columbus Day will be celebrated one after another. Hence, the people came up with October 9th, because it marked the day when the Restoration, a ship that gave birth to the first group of Norwegians who had planned to go to America's shores through proper coordination, arrived in the year 1825. Therefore, Columbus and the Vikings remain the key players. According to historical accounts, Christopher Columbus, an Italian navigator, discovered America in the form of Guanahani, most likely San Salvador Island, but probably another, or the Turks and Caicos Islands, with his 3-ship flotilla financed by the Spanish in 1492 as he was searching for a shortcut to Asia. During this period, another Italian navigator, John Cabot, who sailed for England, made his voyage to Canada, but not until 1497, a few years later than Columbus. The consequence was that Columbus became almost unanimously accredited as being the first person to discover America. Despite this assertion, there are 2 medieval Norse sagas, heroic poems of prose that talk about Viking expeditions to Vinland. Based on the Greenlanders saga, it is believed that Bjarni Herjolfsson was the first European to see North America as a continent after his trip to Greenland went wrong around 985 AD, and he was carried by the wind far away towards the west. The Vikings indeed came to North America, and, although they did not engage in the actual exploration of America, it is also true that they were far ahead of Columbus. Now that we have an idea that Vikings were the first to explore America, let us learn some quick facts about them. Most people think of Vikings as men with long beards, wearing horned helmets charging into battle. Yet, things could have been far less interesting. Though it is known that they did wear helmets, none of the Viking helmets that remain have horns on them. The most likely set of people who started showing Vikings having horns on their helmets is the painters in their drawings from around the 19th century. Instead of portraying historical accuracy, they might have done this to make things look more dramatic. The Viking Age is noted for its popularity in historical images, but did you know that their culture is rooted in Norse mythology? In the family of Odin, Thor, and Freya, gods and goddesses of the Norse traditional societies, worshipping these deities helped in shaping the whole Viking outlook. Vikings believed that those who gallantly departed in wars when killed were given honorable places within the great Valhalla chambers, where they would live for eternity enjoying sumptuous meals as their souls relished in the ever-desired immortality. Vikings were masters of trade and travel. Vikings may be more remembered as fierce fighters, but they were still great businessmen. They managed to master the art of seafaring and making use of the sea to expand their knowledge in places that were formerly considered remote. Eventually, they learned the worth of goods such as furs, amber, or iron, and for these, they obtained precious wares like silks, precious metals, and spices. As they got further, their destinations would reach as far as Constantinople and Baghdad. Vikings were incredibly hygienic. When it comes to the Vikings, cleanliness is probably not the first thing that comes to your mind. Murderous-looking men cramped together in one vessel is something nobody would associate with cleanliness. Nevertheless, there have been archaeological discoveries that show that at least some Vikings made primitive tweezers, refinements, as well as combs from animal bones. Additionally, historical facts show that they used to bathe once a week at least, a practice which was relatively good based on the standard of those days. Not all Vikings were violent. There is a perception that Vikings were a marauding clan who went to loot towns without thinking twice. However, many Vikings were mostly involved in peaceful activities such as trading or making complex items. Amazingly, the majority of Vikings engaged in agriculture, preferring to plant barley and oats rather than waging war. Yes, it is kind of weird to picture a peaceful Viking. Who would have thought? Vikings loved to ski. Before skiing claimed its current popularity as a good holiday activity, it was considered as the typical spare time pursuit for the Viking. Skiing in Scandinavia began some 6,000 years back, and it has been well known since the Viking ages. During that time, skiing provided an effective means of moving around, an intelligent hunting method, and an excellent source of enjoyment. The Vikings were so obsessed with skiing that they even worshipped the god of skiing, Olar, at his feet. Vikings buried their dead in boats. Vikings did not only utilize boats for raiding and plundering, but they actively used them in burial ceremonies. Vikings believed that brave soldiers ascended into Valhalla, the heavenly world according to Norse religion, after an honorable death. To ensure they were safely ferried over after death, boats were considered the most fitting conveyances by them. Some high-ranking Vikings and prominent ladies were even honored with the privilege of being buried with their weapons and riches, and sometimes sacrificed slaves. The ships were used by Vikings for raiding and other uses. Many Vikings died in battles on land in continental Europe. In a huge storm that occurred in 876 on the south coast of England, about 4,000 people with 120 boats drowned together, and when important Vikings died, they were buried in a burial ship, along with their clothes, jewelry, and even horses and cattle they owned. The Oseberg burial mound is one of the most significant graves discovered in Scandinavia. In the year 834, the Oseberg queen was buried in a striking ship, with all her valuable possessions. The grave also held the bones of yet another woman whose background remained obscure. Viking ships. For ages, the design of the Vikings' iconic vessels, known as longships, was taken over by multiple cultures and has continued to influence ship construction to the present day. It entails laying overlapping slabs of oak that are fastened collectively and then protecting them with layers of wool dipped in tar or coated animal fur. The reason behind their speed in moving across waters is that they have narrow but lengthy hulls that are not far from being stable, as they are landlocked due to the presence of a keel. It was light enough to be carried, and this aided in its speed and ease of navigation in shallow waters, being a double-ended longship that could turn quickly without the necessity of turning around. Thus, it was much more advantageous when there were so many hidden icebergs or even sea ice on the sea. On lucky days, rowers could attain 15 to 17 knots. Much of Viking warriors' capacity for surprisingly rapid incursions was dependent on the speed at which they could move due to the fast sailing abilities of their vessels. Their marine innovations facilitated a connection between northern and southern Europe that had a strong impact on the continent. The long boats had oars stretching almost the whole length of the boat, but the later versions had sails too. Female power. What role did women play in Viking history? They say that the position of a woman in Viking society was stronger than in most other parts of Europe. In the event of a divorce, they had the right to a share in the wealth, which usually meant land, since it was the only real form of significant wealth at the time, or livestock such as cattle, depending on the region. If a husband died, his wife would gain ownership of his property. She would also keep all his belongings. They were protected against sexual assault to some extent under the law. The woman was always respected and regarded as the head of her farm in her husband's long absence. While the husband was away, the wife would never desert the place. What people are fascinated about regarding the Viking lifestyle is a trend that is not characterized only by their seafaring warrior pictures, but also by how they contributed to creating a new order that birthed today's modern life. The Vikings and religion. Norse mythology. The Vikings followed a way of life that was greatly influenced by their belief in Norse mythology. Several gods and goddesses, including Odin, Thor, and Freya, played major roles in forming their cultural practices and rituals. Temples were built in Norway to honor these gods as a way of demonstrating their deep connection with the natural environment. During the Viking Age, a notable move in religions was witnessed as the Norse societies slowly came to accept Christianity. As the adopters of Christianity in their societies, they introduced some cultural alterations that later compelled changes from the traditional Norse lifestyle. Among the people who made the Vikings convert from their old pagan nature was Olav Tryggvason, who worked as one of the missionaries, tradesmen, and farmers. In contrast to being a history drenched in bloodshed, conflict, and looting, there was a significant part of the Norwegian Viking history and tradition that was comparatively peaceful. Vikings who hauled produce and other goods for trade reasons were also found among them, but as well as farmers who relied on this activity as a source of livelihood. They established bases for trading at Dublin, Ireland, and York, England, as well as opening trade routes between Newfoundland, Canada, and the Volga River Russian Federation. On farming accounts, Vikings dedicated a significant part of their lives to agriculture and household chores. The main activity in the Viking Age was farming because people who lived there engaged themselves in farming by growing crops and keeping animals for food, among other things. It's worth noting that during the winter months, when it was colder than usual or there was little light available because of lack of sunlight hours, they had to plan extensively in terms of conservation and distribution of resources, whereby they developed into tough people that could sustain themselves. Who were the major Norwegian Viking kings? Here's a rundown of the major Norwegian Viking kings so you can learn more about these rulers of the Viking Age. Harald Fairhair, 850 to 932. In the historical sagas, Harald Fairhair was the first king of Norway between 872 and 930 with a unified country under his rule. He is therefore considered as Norway's unifier, since before his time it was composed of many small kingdoms mostly located along coastlines. The desire for Gyda as a princess forced him to unite his people so that he could marry her, because she had not agreed to be a wife unless she married him in her country. In a sequence of battles, Harald triumphed and turned into the solitary sovereign, which is a notable attainment to the establishment of Norway's nation. Not only in the 12th and 13th centuries, but up to the current date, his influence has had a great impact on the socio-political setting of Norway. Erik Bloodaxe, 885 to 954. One of Harald Fairhair's numerous offspring was Erik Bloodaxe, who was notorious for his fierceness in war and his participation in youthful Viking raids. This title, which means a brutal and brutal nature, was given to Bloodaxe. Between 933 and 935, Erik took over the kingship in Norway, although after some time he was pushed away by Håkon the Good, his half-brother. The king also embarked on other Viking ventures there during his tenure in Northumbria, a part of northeastern England. Erik's rule is characterized by the desire to prove ownership through wars and rapacious expeditions that upheld the Vikings' fearsome reputation. Håkon the Good. Magshay, 918 to 961. After dethroning his brother Erik Bloodaxe, Håkon the Good succeeded as the king of Norway. He ruled from 934 to 961, and is mainly known for trying to spread Christianity in Norway. However, this failed in his time. He is also remembered for changing certain things in governance, which contributed a lot towards making sure that all regions worked together as one nation. His reign is often seen as a period of consolidation and peace compared to the turbulent rule of his brother, Olav Tryggvason, 963 to 1000. Olav Tryggvason was a prominent figure in the Christianization of Norway. He ruled from 995 to 1000, during which he played a crucial role in bringing many Norwegians into the Christian faith, and in 995 built the very first Christian church in Norway. In 997, Olav also established the city of Trondheim, which later became a major religious political capital. His time in office oversaw major religious and cultural changes aimed at making Christianity the leading religion in Norway. Olav II of Norway, later Saint Olav, 993 to 1030. King Olav II Haraldsson, popularly known as Saint Olav, reigned as ruler over Norway between 1015 to 1028 AD, and his ascendance marked a significant turning point in the spread of Christianity within that territory. After dying during the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030 AD, he was declared a saint, due to which he would forever be remembered both as a patriot and fervent believer in Christianity. Every year in Norway, people celebrate Olsak Day because he helped reshape religion in Norway, as well as strengthen its relationship with the Christian world, thanks to his efforts. Magnus the Good, 1024 to 1047. Magnus the Good was the son of Olav II. He was king of Norway from 1035 to 1047, and Denmark from 1042, till he died in 1047. His rule is known for having brought more peace and order to his kingdoms than before. The title good was given to him principally on account of his efforts to lessen the savagery that had made up society previously. He did much work in reinforcing legality and bureaucracy, thereby making the government more organized and centralized. Harald Hardrada, 1015 to 1066. Harald Hardrada, who was a king with the skills of a warrior, ruled Norway from 1046 until he died in 1066. He started his life by living adventures and being an expatriate after the Battle of Stiklestad. On his return to his own country, he claimed the throne after years of serving as King of Norway and fought in the Byzantine army. Harald's death happened during a battle against Anglo-Saxon enemies at Stamford Bridge, marking the end of the Viking era, since he could not penetrate England, led to England's invasion by William of Normandy. The Viking way of life, as well as some of its implications upon European history, as a whole continues to be symbolized by his undertakings and the life he lived. Vikings are often depicted in video games and movies as brutal savages with giant helmets and empty heads, whereas they stand for much more than that in their motives and cultural constructs. The Old Norse word Viking means pirate raid. It was a tradition for men in Scandinavia to go on Vikings during the summers. The majority of these voyages were not composed of pillaging villages and ravishing women as many would imagine. In most cases, they were aimed at seeking new territories through exchange, and even had their code of law. Most people today have a wrong impression of Vikings because of Catholic propaganda. The denominational religion lost various amenities, prizes, and sacred objects to the Scandinavians. For this reason, the church tried over time to depict them as savages, the end of the Viking Age. If you're wondering, are there still Vikings or do Vikings still exist? The answer is no. The Viking Age more or less came to a close with the events of 1066 in England. By this time, all the kingdoms in Scandinavia had adopted Christianity, and whatever remained of Viking culture was being absorbed into Christian European culture. Consequently, today one can trace Viking heritage through some words spoken and place names that have their roots among these mainly Danish-speaking communities in northern England, Scotland, or Russia. By the time the Viking Age moved on, native disagreements and authority issues had started to eat into the very fabric of Norse communities. The same disintegration of central power that had always shielded them from foreign invasions was the same thing that resulted in these people fighting among themselves. Great leaders were competing for a chance at leadership, while there was no single ruler to ensure peace prevailed.